Shalom, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this latest episode of the Leaving Babylon series. In the last episode, we talked about the Creator's calendar, as provided through Genesis 1:14, which uses the sun and the moon. And I'm sure that there's many things that came up that differ from possible teachings that you've heard on the internet, but the ultimate test is that you apply the scriptures. And the calendar that Yahweh created from the beginning and established involves the sun and the moon. Those are the markers that help us to gauge time. So if you've learned something different that uses something other than the sun and the moon, or just a portion thereof, then you better re-examine those teachings and apply the scriptures to those traditions that you've learned, and just make sure that they pass muster. Now, specifically, we talked about the two great lights, the sun and the moon, and that they're in the heavens for signs, for Moedim, for days and for years. And we talked about why the Karaite tradition and the Jewish calendars both add to and take away the Torah. And of course, that's something that's prohibited by the Torah, and we do not want to be following any traditions that add to or take away from the Torah. We don't need to examine barley crops in month 12 to determine whether or not we start a new year. Crops do not determine the calendar. The sun and the moon determine the calendar. They determine years, and we use the sun and the moon to intercalate. That's a term that's used to when we add a 13th month. It's called intercalation. And we use the sun and the moon to intercalate. We don't use barley. And we talked about how the sun and the moon alone are used for determining days and months. And of course, the purpose of understanding the calendar is so that we can properly keep the Moedim, the appointed times. The Creator has established these appointments every year. And believe me, He's keeping those times on His calendar. Whether you're there or not, or whether you're keeping them on His calendar or not, rest assured, He is keeping them, and he doesn't have multiple dates for these things. He has specific dates, times, and locations for these appointed times. And so the key is that we get in synchronicity with Him, not that He gets in synchronicity with us. He controls the calendar. He sets the dates. It's up to us to keep the appointments. The annual cycle of the Moedim begins in month 1. And month 1 is commonly referred to as the month of Aviv, but we saw from the scriptures that it actually says the month of the Aviv. We mentioned that Aviv does not exclusively refer to a stage of growth for the barley plant, but rather it refers to a time, a season when life springs forth. In fact, the word Aviv is actually quite amazing. In past episodes, we talked about how the Hebrew Aleph Bet includes 22 characters starting from Aleph and ending with the Ta. And all the characters are encompassed within the Aleph and the Ta, and that word ultimately represents the Messiah. That He is the Word. He is everything that was spoken into this creation, and He was there at creation doing the creating through the Word. So all of the characters in the ancient Hebrew language actually tell a story through pictures. Now, you don't necessarily see that in the modern Hebrew language, but if you look back at the ancient and Paleo language, you see they're actually pictures, and there's a story built into the progression of the Aleph Ta that begins with the Aleph and ends with the Ta. And we also see a progression of words through the Aleph Bet. In other words, starting with the first character Aleph, we begin to create words in sequence. Of course, the Aleph itself does not constitute a word, but when we affix the Bet, the next character, we have a word. So Aleph Bet is the first word that we can come up with in the Hebrew language in order, and it means Ab, father. So the first word that's possible in the Hebrew language is father. And according to the Klein's etymological dictionary of the Hebrew language, Ab can also mean young shoot or sprout. It refers to the beginning of life for a plant. So that's amazing that this is the first word that we can actually come up with in the Hebrew language is Av, and it refers to father and also the springing forth of life in a young plant. The second word that can be formed is Aleph Bet Aleph, and that's Abba, which means, again, father or daddy. And so how incredible that the first two words in the Hebrew language both refer to the Father and the source of life, the beginning of life, the source of the seed of life. Now, the third word in the Hebrew language that can be formed through the Aleph Bet is Aleph Bet Bet, pronounced Abab, denominated from Abib. And it's the root of Abib, and according to Klein, it means to bring forth shoots, to sprout, the coming of spring, refreshing renewal. So the root of Abib is the third possible Hebrew word after Ab and Abba, father and daddy. And it's just incredible that this is also connected to father. Of course, the appointed times are times when we're supposed to connect with the Father by meeting with Him and synchronizing with His covenant plan. Now, this should really amplify the power and the significance of the appointed times that begin in the month of the Aviv. And the appointed times are listed in sequence in Leviticus 23, and I'm just going to provide a summary of the list. First, we have Passover, known as Pesach in Hebrew. The second is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Hag Hamatzot. The third is the Feast of Weeks, Hag Shavuot. The fourth is the Day of Blasting, or the Day of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. The fifth is a Day of Atonements, Yom HaKippurim, or Yom Kippur. The sixth is the Feast of Tabernacles, Hag Sukkot. And the seventh and the final appointed time is the eighth day. It's referred to in the scriptures, Shemini Atzeret. So we have 7 appointed times which span the course of 7 months, beginning at the first month. 3 are designated as feasts, or Hagim. And these are literally pilgrimage feasts when those in covenant with Yahuwah go to the place where He chooses to place His name, His house, in other words, where He resides. We're supposed to go visit and meet with Him wherever He sets up His house. And these are very special times that need to be recognized. They're all special times. 3 require travel, and Hag Hamatzah would naturally coincide with Passover, which occurs 1 full day before the feast begins. So you actually would have Passover and Hag Hamatzot constituting a pilgrimage feast, because you're obviously going to be coming to Hag Hamatzot, so you'll be there 1 day earlier for Passover. And Hag Sukkot, which is the last pilgrimage feast, would naturally include Shemini Atzeret, which occurs the day after Sukkot ends. So actually we have 5 of the 7 occurring at the house of Yahuwah, where He places His name. Now, we don't have the time to examine each one of them in depth. We do go into greater detail in the Walk in the Light series book entitled Appointed Times. In this teaching, though, we're going to just have an overall picture of why they're important for everyone in the covenant. And as I said before in a previous teaching, they're not Jewish holidays. The religion of Judaism follows the rabbinic teachings of the Pharisees, which are often different from the Torah. And that's one of the things that Yeshua was pointing out in his various confrontations with the Pharisees. He was pointing out that they were adding to and taking away from the Torah. Again, this is expressly forbidden. So they've developed their own calendar that does not use the sun and the moon. It's simply a calculation created by men. So the Jews do actually have their own Jewish holidays that mirror the appointed times detailed in the scriptures, but they celebrate them differently based upon the rules and regulations of the Pharisees and following the calendar of the Pharisees. They have their own traditions revolving these appointed times developed by the rabbis, so we really don't want to be following the appointed times as the Jews do, celebrating their Jewish holidays. They don't believe in or follow Yeshua the Messiah, so they're not in the renewed covenant. that was instituted by the Messiah, and which is really integral to these appointed times. We who believe in Messiah can truly celebrate these appointed times and understand the fullness of them when we see Messiah's past fulfillment and his future fulfillment. So the last thing we should be doing when we're leaving Babylon and we're leaving the pagan holidays that we learned of in Christianity, the last thing that we should be doing is going and now following the Pharisaic traditions regarding these appointed times that completely miss and oftentimes intentionally delete Yeshua the Messiah or any trace of his fulfillment of these appointed times. So those of us who are following the Messiah recognize that he came to fulfill the Torah literally. And we'll examine that more in the next episode when we further look at the renewed covenant. But for now, let's just look at the timing and purpose of the Moedim. The first in order is Pesach, and it occurs on month 1, day 14. And this is one appointed time that people are often confused about because there is a tradition that's developed in Rabbinic Judaism to essentially merge the Passover, which is it's a day, but the primary focus of this Passover is a meal, a covenant meal. And what they've done is essentially moved it from the beginning of day 14, which occurs in the evening at sundown. They've moved it now to day 15. So it actually merges with the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover is a separate day. It occurs on day 14. We detail this in various articles that we have on the internet, as well as our book, The Appointed Times. And in that you can see that the Passover begins at the beginning of day 14. There's a full day cycle concludes, and then on day 15, at the end of day 14, then we begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7-day feast, which starts and ends with a high Sabbath. So that causes confusion for many, and they end up actually observing the Pesach on the wrong day. They merge it with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and these are two separate Moedim. So Pesach occurs month 1, day 14. Hag HaMatzot starts on day 15 of month 1 and continues on 7 days through day 21 of month 1. Day 15 is a high Sabbath, and day 21 is a high Sabbath. And we already mentioned that while these are two separate appointed times, they often are collectively referred to as Passover. Another third appointed time is Shavuot, and it's the one feast that does not have a specific day and month assigned to it in the Torah. Rather, it occurs 50 days after a special presentation of the barley that occurs during Hag HaMatzot. Now, some people try to peg that presentation of an omer of barley as a separate feast, and they call it the Feast of First Fruits, but this is simply incorrect. The presentation of the barley is called the Reshit offering, and it's made by the priest before the grain harvest begins. So it's the first, and literally that's what Reshit means. Now remember how the scriptures begin with Bereshit, in the beginning? Well, the Reshit means first or beginning. So the Reshit barley offering is the first of the grain harvest, and it occurs during the Feast of Matzot. And it's not a feast within a feast, it's simply an event that occurs within the feast, which then ties it to the count of the following feast of Shavuot. So essentially, some even call Shavuot the Etzeret of Passover, because these two are intimately connected. Shavuot is really the Feast of First Fruits, which occurs after the counting of 7 weeks and 50 days. And we read in Exodus 34:22, and you shall observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of wheat harvest. And the word for first fruits used when describing Shavuot is Bikurim. And that's why Shavuot really is the Feast of First Fruits. That's when everybody brings their first fruits of wheat from their villages and their fields and their barns. They bring their first fruits to Jerusalem for Shavuot after the wheat harvest. So the grain harvest begins during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the grain harvest culminates with Shavuot, when people bring their first fruits from throughout the land. So we can see that Pesach, Hag HaMatzot, is intimately tied and connected with Shavuot, and it is because it constitutes, basically brackets the grain harvest. Now Shavuot will always occur toward the beginning of month 3, and Shavuot is also a high Sabbath. Now all of the remaining appointed times occur in month 7. Yom Teruah occurs on day 1 of month 7. It is a high Sabbath, and since it occurs on the first day of the month, people would know exactly when day 1 of month 7 occurred by looking up and sighting the first sliver of the new moon. It would be impossible for common people to properly observe this day if only a select few astronomers were using the astronomical conjunction, as we talked about in the last episode, the dark moon. If they were using that to determine the first day of the month, it would be absolutely confusing and people would not know when that moment occurred, so then to start observing day 1 of the month. Of course, it's obvious that this was not the case, and that fact will become even clearer when we discuss Messiah's fulfillment of this appointed time, because it occurred on a specific date when we're given a sign in Scriptures, and we know when that sign occurred, and we know that it was the first sliver of the new moon that actually was announcing day 1 of month 7. We'll talk about that in the next episode. So 10 days following Yom Teruah is Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonements. It's actually plural in the Torah, although oftentimes it's just called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It really speaks of Day of Atonements. And that's really an important distinction when we understand really the purpose of Yom Kippur. It too is a high Sabbath, and it's really distinct from all other high Sabbaths. It's a very solemn day. No work whatsoever is to be performed. Now, on some of the high days in the other feasts, when there's cooking allowed, because it's a feast, you're supposed to be eating and cooking and feasting. But on this day, nothing. You're not supposed to do any work whatsoever, and we're commanded to afflict our beings. So most people translate that as a day of fasting also. That's considered to be the Great Fast. So of course there'd be no cooking if you're fasting anyway. So this is a day, very somber day, that concludes the traditional 40 days of Teshuvah, as well as the 10 days of awe that traditionally begins at Yom Teruah. Now at the conclusion of Yom Kippur, we enter the season of joy. And by this time, the fruits of the land have been harvested, the dates, the figs, the pomegranates, the olives, and the grapes. And people will then bring the first fruits to the place where Yah puts his name to celebrate Sukkot. And we begin Sukkot on day 15 of month 7 and celebrate Sukkot for 7 days. Only the first of the 7 days is a high Sabbath in Sukkot. And during these 7 days, we're commanded to rejoice. Well, we live in temporary structures known as sukkahs or booths or tabernacles, some people call them. The 7 days conclude on day 21 of month 7, often referred to as the last great day. And then following the 7th day of Sukkot, the season of joy culminates with the appointed time, which is a high Sabbath known as Shemini Atzeret. And it's referred to as the 8th day. So again, it's intimately connected with Sukkot, because of course we've just had 7 days of Sukkot, and this is referred to as the 8th day, but it's a separate feast in and of itself, and it has special significance. It actually occurs on day 22, which is really interesting because it's the 8th day feast, but it occurs on day 22 of month 7. And of course, we talked about the fact that the Hebrew alphabet contains 22 characters. And so when we look at this 7th month, we see that Yom Teruah is the Aleph of the 7th month, and Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day, is the Ta of the 7th month. So we see a powerful messianic significance in the appointed times of the 7th month. And of course, we look for Yeshua to actually fulfill these feasts of the 7th month, especially in his second coming. Now, just as Passover is separate but connected with the 7-day Hag HaMatzot, again, Shemini Atzeret is separate but connected with the 7-day feast of Sukkot. So the entire cycle of the appointed times is bracketed by 8 days in month 1 and 8 days in month 7. And it all culminates on the 8th day when we're no longer required to live in sukkahs. And of course, 8 represents new beginnings and the fulfillment of the covenant promise. And that's why the covenant of circumcision occurs on the 8th day after a male child is born. While this creation in time is currently focused on cycles of 7, the covenant promise points us to transcending into cycles of 8 when the covenant reaches its fulfillment. Now that we've examined the various scheduling issues, let's just take an overall view of these times. In the last episode, we talked about the Karaite tradition of looking for Aviv barley in month 12, and basically determining the beginning of a new year based upon the existence or non-existence of sufficient amounts of Aviv barley in the land in month 12 before the sighting of the new moon. So a lot of subjective opinions needed to be rendered by men in order to make these determinations. Now the reason they do this is because they know that Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are focused on the beginning of the grain harvest in the land. And of course the barley is the grain that ripens first. Where they go astray is the assumption that they need sufficient amounts of Aviv barley in month 12, prior to month 1 of a new year, referred to again as the month of the Aviv. We don't need Aviv barley in month 12. We only need Aviv barley in month 1, and it doesn't have to be at the beginning of month 1. It can be in the middle of the month. In fact, the scriptures provide that you can offer parched barley. So there's no requirement for the barley to be in any special state when Passover and Hag HaMatzot occur. So there's a lot of assumptions built into this that, again, they're adding to the Torah, and they've created their own unique calendar. Now, it likely has good intentions to get us in the right time when the barley is going to be harvested. But the rule of the equinox resolves that matter, and it makes all of the Karaite traditions moot. Again, the first 3 appointed times encompass the grain harvest. It spans from the Reshit offering made by the priest to the Bikurim offering brought by the people at Shavuot. When the people come for Passover, they make an offering of blood. They sacrifice the lamb of Elohim. During the feast, they eat no leaven, and the priest then cuts and offers the first of the grain offering. That starts the grain harvest and also the count to Shavuot. We read in Deuteronomy 16:9, "You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain." And of course, that's why the feast is called Shavuot. Shavuot means weeks, literally, and we're supposed to be counting weeks when we put the sickle to the grain. And of course, the priest putting the sickle to the grain is what initiates not only the grain harvest, but also the count to Shavuot. And no one can harvest the grain until this first offering is made by the priest. And this is where the Karaite tradition can really wreak havoc, because if they make an incorrect judgment call and prolong the harvest by intercalating a month 13 because they don't believe that they've observed sufficient amounts of barley in month 12, that could result in people not being able to harvest ripened crops. So literally, if a decision was made and it was wrong, people could be sitting there in month 13 looking at ripe barley, which they couldn't harvest because the priest hadn't offered up the Reshit barley offering yet. And of course, time, mildew, weather, all sorts of things could damage and destroy the crops while they're sitting there waiting for the harvest. So, in fact, there may be times when barley crops appear very young in month 12, and then a hot spell occurs in the beginning of the following month, rapidly accelerating the growth of the crops. And the important thing to remember is that you don't need barley to be at a specific stage of maturity in month 12. So the whole premise of the Karaite tradition is false. You simply need to be able to make a Reshit offering in the middle of month 1 on day 16, the day following the first high Sabbath. So the Israelites would have wanted to harvest their crops as early as possible. So you want month 1 in the Passover to occur as early as possible, close to the equinox and springtime. Again, the time of Aviv, the month of the Aviv. The goal is for the priest to make the Reshit offering as soon as possible so that people can all leave the feast and go harvest their crops. A delay would be devastating to farmers, and the rule of the equinox ensures that that does not occur. So after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, everyone would return to their homes, harvest the grain, first the barley, then the wheat, and they would then return at Shavuot with their bikurim, the first fruits from their wheat harvest. So at Passover, they come with a lamb. At Shavuot, they come with their wheat, their bread. And this points to how the Messiah would fulfill those appointed times. And now in day 1 of month 7, it was traditionally a time when the kings of Judah would be anointed and their reigns would be reckoned from that day. So we see a vivid picture of the coming king judging and making atonement at the beginning of month 7. And after those appointed times, those in the kingdom can then come to the king's palace with their wine and their fruit and their offerings, and they can rejoice together in temporary dwellings for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, they no longer need to live in those temporary dwellings. When the covenant is fulfilled, they can move in with the king on the 8th day. And we already talked about how the first 7 words in the Hebrew Scriptures provide a pattern for time, patterned around 7s. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Those are the 7 words that we read in the Hebrew, and we see that they create the menorah, and they create a framework for time. And most understand that mankind is given 6,000 years, followed by a 1,000-year millennial reign, the reign of the Messiah. After the 7th millennium, though, we look to the new beginnings, the 8th day. That's when we read it in the book of Revelation, how the New Jerusalem descends from the heavens. And so there's something new that's going to occur at the end of the 7th millennium. And anyone who's ever read the Scriptures from the beginning realizes that we're not at that point yet. Man has a problem that has not been resolved fully. Man was originally made in the image of Elohim. Man and woman were supposed to live in the garden. They were supposed to live in paradise. And the garden was a set-apart place. And yeah, it's important to understand the entire earth was not paradise. The entire earth was not, the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was just a small portion of the earth. It was essentially the headquarters of the kingdom. And the man and woman were supposed to take dominion over this planet and populate it and rule over it. We read in Genesis 1:28, "Then Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So they were given a kingdom to rule and reign over. But that kingdom came with instructions. See, they were here as the image of Elohim. They were here representing Elohim on this planet. So they were given instructions and guidance, and they chose to disobey those instructions. And as a result, these images of Elohim were rejected from the house as rebellious children. And instead of being clothed with light, they were covered by death, literally. And we read about that in Genesis 3:21. Also for Adam and his wife, Yahweh Elohim made tunics of skin and clothed them. So this is the first instance when we read about them being clothed with anything. And this verse contains an important Hebrew wordplay, something that you don't see in the English. The word for light is or. It's spelled Aleph Vav Resh. And the word translated as skins in Genesis 3:21 is or, ayin vav resh. So instead of starting with an aleph, as does light, the word for skin begins with an ayin, which represents an eye. So these words are both very similar, but the word for skin literally represents an eye connected to the head. The eye, the vav is a connector, and the resh is a head. So you have the symbolism of an eye connected to the head. And we know that the disobedience of the man and the woman resulted in their eyes being open. They now recognized that they were naked and they were ashamed. Well, the common understanding is that they were covered with animal hides, representing an atonement made on their behalf. And of course, atonement is kippur. There's a deeper meaning here, that they were originally clothed with light, and that light was exchanged for the skin that we now have. Thus, they were now clothed with skin and naked, having their eyes opened through the sin with the serpent in the garden. And unlike light, this skin that we have, it gets marked and it gets old and it gets dry and it gets wrinkled and it wears out and eventually it turns into dust. And this is how we actually see the promised curse upon man. In Genesis 3:19 it says, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken. From dust you are, and to dust you shall return." So man came from dust, and now he would return to dust because of this skin that wears out and dries up and ultimately disintegrates. And while he was supposed to partake of the fruits of the trees of the garden, he now had to toil for bread. And of course, bread comes from grain, and this is the pattern back to the garden that we see through the appointed times. We toil for our bread, from unleavened bread to Shavuot, the grain harvest. Then we look to month 7, when the king provides atonement, so that we can enjoy the fruit of the kingdom and experience new beginnings as we get new bodies and move back into the house. So we see a reverse path, the path out of the garden. We actually see a reverse path through the appointed times as to how we're going to get back into the garden. Now, we currently can't survive in the presence of Elohim in this present state of flesh, this wearing this skin that we have. And man is no longer perfect in the image of Elohim. So mankind has this problem. How does he get back into the garden and live with a being of light, Elohim, a perfect Elohim? How do we get renewed bodies so that we can dwell in this garden? And we're provided the answers and the rehearsals through the appointed times. And we're given a pattern for that plan through the life of Abram, who was then later named Abraham. We see it progress through Yisrael and on through the Messiah. So these appointed times are integral and important, and we provide much more information in the Walk in Light series, Appointed Times. They're rich with meaning, and I encourage you to investigate them and start walking them out. As you walk out of Babylon, begin to walk in the light and walk in the pattern of the appointed times, which leads us back into the garden through the renewed covenant made by the Messiah. In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at the renewed covenant, because unless you understand the promise of renewal and a renewed covenant, you'll never fully understand the fulfillment offered by the Messiah. So until next time, my name is Todd Bennett. Shalom.